The sky outside my window was the color of wet concrete, a heavy blanket pressing down on the town. October had come in sharp this year, winds rattling the windows, trees shedding their last stubborn leaves. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-written grocery list in front of me, when the phone rang. "My name is Charlotte Hayes, and this is how everything began to fall apart." Melissa's voice on the other end was tight, brittle around the edges. "Mom's gone," she said, not much softer than if she were reading a headline. We need you to come home." The world blurred for a second, the walls leaning in too close. I don't remember much of what I said. Something about catching the next flight, about being there as soon as I could, because that's what you do when you're family. You show up. The airport was a mess of tired faces and clattering luggage, the smell of burnt coffee and rain clinging to the air. I watched the city shrink below me through the plane window, heart aching, memories clawing their way back from wherever I'd buried them. When I pulled up to the old house, the porch light was on, casting long shadows over the sagging steps. For a second, I almost expected my mother to open the door, apron dusted with flour, voice calling my name like I was still 16. But the house felt different, hollowed out, as if the grief had already gutted it from the inside. "Melissa," answered the door, her smile sharp and hurried, the kind people wear when they don't want you to look too closely. She hugged me, a quick, perfunctory thing, and pulled me inside before I could say much of anything. The living room was unrecognizable. New furniture, new pictures, none of them with me in them. Toys littered the floor, and somewhere in the back, a baby wailed. The air smelled like microwave dinners and something sour underneath, something left too long unattended. I set my bag down carefully by the door, heart thudding strangely in my chest. Something was wrong. Not just the loss, not just the strange, empty silence where my mother's presence should have been. It was the way Melissa looked past me, already moving into the kitchen, calling orders over her shoulder. It was the way the house, once a cradle of memories, now pulsed with a cold, unfamiliar rhythm. I had come home. But home, it seemed, wasn't mine anymore. The house I grew up in always smelled like fresh laundry and lemon cleaner, a fortress of neatness and quiet rules. Even as a child, I understood there was an order to everything. What you said, how you behaved, the way you existed within the walls my mother kept so tightly wound around us. Melissa was the light that filled the house, and I was the shadow that stayed just outside the frame. She was the child people noticed, blonde hair catching the sunlight, laughter that floated through the halls like music. Teachers adored her, neighbors fawned over her. Even when she misbehaved, even when she brought home grades that were less than perfect, the world seemed to lean toward her, forgiving and warm. I wasn't jealous, not exactly. Just aware. Aware of the way my mother's eyes lit up a little brighter when Melissa entered a room. Aware of the way my achievements, neat rows of A's, the certificates tucked carefully into drawers, were met with a nod rather than applause. I learned early that love in our house was a currency, and Melissa spent it freely while I hoarded scraps. It wasn't that I was unloved. It was just that love had rules for me. Be reliable. Be invisible unless needed. Don't complain. Don't demand more than what's given. So I became the dependable one. The quiet one. The one who could. Be trusted to clean up after Melissa's messes without making a scene. The one who could be counted on to smile politely through dinners where Melissa's latest adventure, her newest success, was the only topic worth discussing. I remember one Christmas, I must have been 12, when I spent weeks making a photo collage for our mother, piecing together snapshots of the three of us, layering them carefully into a frame I had saved from my allowance. Melissa, predictably, forgot to get a gift. On Christmas morning, I watched as my mother unwrapped my handmade present, smiled politely, and set it aside without a second glance. Later that afternoon, Melissa threw together a sloppy, glittered card on the back of an old cereal box. My mother cried when she opened it, declaring it the sweetest thing she had ever received. That was the moment I truly understood the rules of our family. Intention didn't matter. Effort didn't matter. The right person would always be enough, even when they gave so little. The wrong person could give everything and still not be seen. By the time we grew up and left for college, or in my case, stayed close to help manage things at home, the pattern was set. Melissa would always be the sun, and I would always orbit quietly in the background, keeping the sky from falling. When I finally walked through the front door, the smell of old wood polish still clung faintly to the air, but everything else felt foreign, wrong, rearranged. Melissa's voice rang out from the kitchen, telling me to make myself at home, as if I wasn't supposed to be home already. The living room had been completely redone, the worn blue sofa replaced with a sleek gray sectional, the old family photos taken down and swapped for glossy, oversized prints of her smiling children. The fireplace mantel, once lined with delicate figurines my mother had loved, was now crowded with plastic toys and stray pieces of mail. I wandered farther in, suitcase bumping awkwardly against my leg, catching glimpses of more changes with every step. New rugs, new curtains, new energy buzzing through the walls, all of it carrying the unmistakable imprint of Melissa. The house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like hers. She emerged from the kitchen carrying a baby on her hip, wiping her free hand on her jeans. "We figured you'd want to stay in the guest room," she said brightly, already turning toward the hallway before I could answer. I followed her numbly, past the familiar banister I used to slide down as a kid, past the hall closet where winter coats used to hang in a musty, colorful tangle. When Melissa threw open the guest room door, a puff of stale air hit my face. The room was cramped, dominated by a pull-out couch and piles of boxed-up holiday decorations. A makeshift office desk was shoved into one corner, cluttered with receipts and half-empty coffee mugs. I stared at it, at the narrow window with its view of the driveway, at the single, sagging pillow tossed on the bed. "What about my old room?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Melissa's smile froze for a second, then reshaped itself. "Oh, we're using it for storage now. You know, just for now. You'll be comfortable here." She said it like a promise, but it felt like a dismissal. Set my suitcase down by the door, the wheels rattling a little too loudly against the hardwood floor. Melissa had already started back down the hall, calling over her shoulder about dinner plans and schedules, like I was another piece of furniture she needed to arrange. As I stood there in the doorway, I realized something sharp and painful. I wasn't returning to a home. I was stepping into someone else's house, and I was already an afterthought. At first, it was small things. A quick favor here, a little help there. Could I swing by the grocery store on my way home from work? Pick up the kids from daycare when Melissa ran late from her yoga class? Wait around for the plumber because she had errands to run? It was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. And for a while, I wasn't. I told myself it was normal. Families pitched in for each other, especially after a loss. Especially when everything still felt so raw. But the favors didn't stop. They multiplied. A list appeared on the fridge one morning, written in neat, breezy handwriting. Milk. Eggs. Pick up dry cleaning. Call insurance. At first, I laughed. Then I realized it wasn't a joke. Melissa had built an entire second life for herself inside those walls, and she had drafted me into it without asking. Days blurred into a routine. That wasn't mine. I became their backup plan, the filler between all the cracks they couldn't be bothered to seal. My own grief, my own life, faded into the background, buried under grocery bags and permission slips and electric bills stamped urgent in red ink. One evening, after another long day of errands and school pickups, I found myself standing in the hallway outside Melissa's bedroom. Her voice drifted through the cracked door, light and careless. "I don't know what we'd do without Charlotte," she was saying, laughing. "Built-in babysitter and house manager, and she doesn't even realize it." The words hit harder than a slap. I turned away, heart pounding in my ears, and stumbled back to the guest room. The guest room, not my room, feeling something shift permanently inside me. I sat down heavily on the edge of the pull-out couch, pulling my phone from my pocket, half out of instinct. I scrolled through old emails from the bank, checking the status of the house, something I hadn't looked at closely since coming back. And there it was, buried in legal jargon, my name, still tied to the property deed. still responsible. Half. The mortgage, half the taxes, half the liability if anything went wrong. I wasn't just helping. I was legally, financially entangled. A silent partner in a life I hadn't agreed to build. I stared at the screen, the letters blurring slightly as realization set in. Melissa hadn't asked for help. She had drafted me into a role, caretaker, provider, safety net, all under the warm, smothering banner of family. And I had walked straight into it, blind and trusting, because that's what good daughters do. Or at least what they're expected to do, until the day they finally wake up. The first time I noticed the overdue notices, they were wedged under a stack of junk mail on the kitchen counter. Thin, tired envelopes marked with urgent red stamps. I brushed them aside without thinking, trying to clear space for the groceries I had been guilted into buying. But as the weeks wore on, the pile grew thicker, heavier, harder to ignore. The power bill, the water bill, property tax warnings. Quiet red flags waving in the corners of my vision. Meanwhile, Melissa and her husband moved through the house with a kind of oblivious ease. A new flat-screen television appeared in the living room one Saturday morning, still wearing the sharp, chemical smell of fresh plastic. A brand new dining set replaced the old oak table we had eaten every family meal around. Boxes stacked by the front door hinted at more: toys, clothes, gadgets they didn't need and couldn't afford. They posted smiling photos online of weekend getaways, spa days, beach trips with the kids, happy, curated moments, polished for strangers. Inside the house, the foundation was rotting. Late at night, I would sit on the edge of the pull-out bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator struggling in the kitchen, the soft whine of the water heater straining to stay alive. The house felt exhausted, like it knew it was carrying a burden it couldn't sustain anymore. And still the spending continued. Still the lights stayed on, the internet connection humming, the packages arriving. It was as if they believed, or hoped, that if they ignored the warnings long enough, the walls would hold themselves up without help. I saw it for what it was: a sinking ship, patching leaks with scraps and smiles. There were mornings when the cold reality of it would hit me before I even opened my eyes. The weight of living in a place where appearances mattered more than stability, where my presence was useful only as long as I was willing to quietly shoulder the growing cracks. They refused to see. I wanted to scream sometimes. I wanted to shake them, to demand they open their eyes, to force them to see the mess gathering beneath the glossy surface they worked so hard to maintain. But I didn't. Instead, I watched. I waited. Because deep down, some part of me knew. My kind of collapse they were inviting didn't need my help. It was already coming, slow and certain, like the tide. It was a Thursday night, the kind that drags long and slow, heavy with the smell of reheated leftovers and tired conversation. I had just finished folding a load of laundry that wasn't mine, sorting tiny socks and mismatched shirts into neat piles on the worn-out guest bed. The windows rattled faintly with the wind outside, a low, restless hum. I was carrying an armful of towels down the hall when I heard it, voices drifting from the living room, careless and unguarded. Melissa, her husband, and one of their friends, laughing over glasses of wine. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I wasn't looking for another wound to carry. But sometimes betrayal doesn't wait for you to seek it out. Sometimes it finds you, slips under the door like smoke you can't ignore. She's basically our live-in help at this point, Melissa said, giggling into her glass. Free nanny, backup wallet, emergency chauffeur, all rolled into one. Honestly, I don't know how we managed before Charlotte moved in. The laughter that followed was sharp, brittle, cutting deeper than any argument could have. I stood there in the half-darkness, towels clutched to my chest, the words sinking deep into my skin. Not sister, not family, useful, convenient, free. The towels slid from my arms, landing in a soft heap at my feet. For a long moment, I just stared at them, feeling the slow, aching burn of humiliation rise in my throat. There was no confrontation, no dramatic outburst. Just a quiet, decisive stillness settling over me. Clearer and heavier than anything I had felt in months, I turned and walked back to the guest room, moving like I was underwater, every step deliberate and slow. The pull-out couch groaned as I sat down heavily, staring at the battered suitcase still tucked under the bed. The same one I had brought with me when I answered that first call, thinking I was coming home to family. I pulled it out, dusted it off, and began to pack. Clothes. Shoes. The photo of Mom I had tucked into my drawer for comfort. No more. Nothing else was mine here. Nothing else was worth keeping. The house murmured around me, the clink of wine glasses, the low thrum of the dishwasher, the television flickering faintly from the den. Life went on in the rooms I was leaving behind, utterly untouched by my absence. I zipped the suitcase closed, the sound loud and final in the stillness. In the end, there were no slammed doors. No shouted accusations, just the steady, unbreakable truth settling into my bones. It was time to walk away, and this time I wouldn't be looking back. I left just after sunrise, when the house was still draped in a soft gray hush and the only sounds were the gentle creaks of the old floorboards beneath my feet. The suitcase rolled quietly behind me, its wheels stuttering against the worn wood. I paused in the kitchen for a moment, taking in the familiar chaos. Dishes stacked haphazardly in the sink, yesterday's mail spilling across the counter, the half-empty cereal boxes leaning tiredly against one another on the table. Life in motion. Life that had no room for me anymore. The spare key, heavy and cool in my hand, felt suddenly alien, a piece of a world that no longer belonged to me. I set it down on the table without ceremony, the soft clink of metal against wood louder than it should have been. No note, no explanation. They wouldn't come looking. I stepped out into the morning air, the sky just beginning to warm from charcoal to pale gold. The suitcase thudded gently down the porch steps, and I didn't glance back. Not at the house, not at the door, not at the life I was shedding with every step away. The apartment I found was nothing special. A small second-floor walk-up with creaky pipes and peeling paint around the windows. But it was mine, every square foot of it. It smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. I bought a mattress and set it directly on the floor. I stacked my few belongings into neat little corners. I opened the windows wide and let the cool air sweep the past out of the rooms. In the evenings, after long hours cobbling together work where I could find it, I sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop balanced on my knees, slowly, methodically researching mortgage law, property rights, co-ownership responsibilities, and eventually a lawyer. It wasn't revenge I was planning, not exactly. It was a correction, a slow, patient unwinding of the knots that had bound me too tightly for too long. I moved quietly, deliberately, like a person piecing herself back together with steady, careful hands. Not rushing, not breaking, just rebuilding. Brick by brick, breath by breath. It was a rainy afternoon when the final truth came to light. I sat across from my lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie whose steady calm had become a strange comfort over the past few weeks. She slid a thin stack of documents across the polished oak desk toward me, her expression carefully neutral. "You need to see this," she said. The pages were photocopies, the ink slightly blurred where the original papers had been folded and hidden. Mortgage refinance applications, new loan agreements, lines filled out with messy handwriting, Melissa's husband's signature scrawled hastily at the bottom of some, blank spaces left waiting for mine on others. They had been preparing to refinance the house, using my name, my credit, my legal, tie to the property, without my knowledge, without my consent. I stared down at the papers, each line a deeper betrayal than the last. It wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just selfishness. It was calculated, premeditated. While I had been running their errands, folding their laundry, watching their children, Melissa and her husband had been plotting to secure a financial future for themselves. Anchored to me like a stone tied to an unwilling swimmer, Valerie's voice was low, measured. "They couldn't finalize without your signature, of course, but they were getting ready. If you hadn't stepped away when you did..." She didn't have to finish the sentence. I understood, the life I had almost trapped myself inside. The life they had crafted so carefully, would have swallowed me whole. My credit ruined, my finances chained to a house sinking deeper into debt. And they would have smiled through it all, thanking me for being such a help. A small part of me wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to rage, to storm back to that house and throw the evidence onto their shiny new dining table, demand explanations, apologies, something. But I didn't. I sat quietly, letting the slow, cold tide of reality wash over me. The betrayal wasn't emotional anymore. It wasn't personal in the way childhood slights and family arguments had once been. It was strategic, transactional. They hadn't just seen me as an afterthought. They had seen me as a resource. I signed the documents Valerie placed in front of me, papers that would begin the legal process to force the sale of the house, to sever the ties they had tried to exploit. The rain tapped steadily against the office window as I slid the pen across each page, a slow, rhythmic sound, almost soothing. It wasn't revenge I felt blooming inside me. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. Cold, clean, and absolute. The paperwork was filed on a Tuesday morning, a neat, unassuming packet sent off with a few signatures and a courier envelope. No drama, no confrontation, just the slow machinery of consequence finally set in motion. Didn't tell Melissa. I didn't warn her. I let the legal notice speak for itself when it arrived, stamped and certified, demanding attention she could no longer brush aside. I imagined the moment she opened it, the confusion, the dawning panic as she realized that the house she had treated like her private kingdom was no longer safe under her careless rule. The mortgage she had ignored, the taxes she had let slip, the debts she had stacked like unstable towers, all of it would come due, and there would be no place to hide, because I wasn't there to shield her anymore. I heard about the fallout through whispers. Through neighbors, mutual friends, a few careful glimpses online. Melissa railing about betrayal, about unfairness, her husband cursing at the cost of lawyers and fees, the frantic attempts to scrape together money they didn't have, to stave off the inevitable sale. But I stayed silent, watching from a distance, steady and unmoved. There was a grim kind of poetry to it, not vengeance exactly, but balance. They had built their lives on my back, confident I would never push back. Confident that I would always bend, always yield. They were wrong. The house, once a symbol of comfort and family, became a burden too heavy for them to carry alone. Without someone to clean up their messes, the weight of their choices pressed, down hard and unforgiving. I didn't celebrate, I didn't gloat. I simply lived my life, quietly, deliberately, savoring the slow, steady freedom of disentangling myself from the wreckage they had created. Justice, I learned, doesn't always come wrapped in fire and fury. Sometimes it comes in paperwork, in deadlines, in the quiet ticking of a clock counting down to an ending you no longer have to fear. It was a gray afternoon when Melissa showed up at my door. I hadn't given her my new address, but somehow she had found it. Desperate people have a way of tracking down what they need. I opened the door to find her standing there, hair frizzy from the drizzle, makeup smudged around her eyes like bruises. For a heartbeat, I saw the sister I used to know, the one who braided my hair when we were kids, who held my hand during thunderstorms. But that girl was long gone, buried beneath layers of choices neither of us could undo. "Charlotte," she said, voice cracking, "please, we can fix this. Just cancel the sale. We'll work something out." I stood there blocking the doorway, the warmth of my small apartment brushing my back, the damp chill clinging to her. She launched into promises, how things would be different, how she hadn't realized what she was doing, how family should stick together. Words spilled out of her in frantic streams, stacking lie on top of half-truth, desperate to build a bridge back to a place we could no longer reach. I listened, quietly, steadily. Not because I believed her, not because I wanted to believe her, but because for once I understood that this moment wasn't about her at all. It was about me. The old Charlotte would have crumbled at the sight of her sister's tears. She would have rushed to patch the cracks, to shoulder the blame, to bleed herself dry trying to make things right, But not this time. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice calm and even. But the sale goes forward. Melissa's mouth opened, closed, struggling for another angle, another plea. But the fight had already left her shoulders, sagging under the weight of consequences she had spent too long pretending she wouldn't have to face. "I didn't mean to," she started, but I raised a hand gently stopping her. "I know," I said, "but you did." For a long moment, we just stood there, the silence between us wide and hollow. Finally, she turned and walked away, her steps slow and heavy against the cracked sidewalk. She didn't look back. I closed the door softly behind her, leaning against the frame for a moment, breathing in the quiet. It wasn't victory I felt. It wasn't vengeance. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes when you finally stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. The kind of peace that tastes like rain and fresh beginnings. The house sold faster than anyone expected. Maybe it was the market. Maybe it was fate, eager to close a chapter that had dragged on too long. Either way, the papers were signed, the keys exchanged, and just like that, the place that had once been my family's anchor passed into other hands. When the check arrived, my share of the sale, I held it for a long moment before depositing it. It felt surreal, holding the physical proof that I had cut the final thread tying me to that crumbling legacy. I didn't waste time dreaming of mansions or glossy downtown condos. I wanted something real, something quiet. The house I found wasn't much on the outside. A small, weathered place tucked into the curve of an old neighborhood street. Faded white siding, a sloping front porch, a lawn more wildflowers than grass. It wasn't impressive. It didn't turn heads. But when I stepped through the door, light poured through every window, casting warm puddles across the worn wooden floors. The air smelled like dust and sunlight. Empty rooms echoed back my footsteps, welcoming, unjudging. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I put the down payment down with steady hands, the pen smooth against the page. No cosigners, no hidden strings. No debts disguised as family obligations. Just me. On move-in day, I brought almost nothing with me. A battered suitcase, a second-hand armchair I found at a flea market, a coffee pot older than I was. I didn't need much. I had learned painfully and beautifully how little you actually need when you've let go of everything weighing you down. As I set the chair by the wide living room window and brewed a pot of coffee, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It wasn't even the middle. It was the first real beginning I'd ever had. Not given, not inherited, not tolerated. Chosen. Built with my own 2 hands, on my own 2 feet. No more chaos humming in the background. No more tight smiles and buried anger. Just peace, just space to breathe. Just sunlight falling softly through windows that, for the first time in a long time, opened into a future that was finally, gloriously, mine. The afternoon light slanted through, the windows, soft and golden, catching the dust motes as they drifted lazily through the air. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, letting the quiet fill the space like a slow, steady heartbeat. One by one, I pulled out small pieces of my life, a chipped mug, a stack of well-read books, a threadbare quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and clean cotton, objects that had followed me through the chaos, through the hurt, through the slow, painful untangling of a life I no longer lived. At the bottom of one box, wrapped carefully in an old dish towel, I found it. The photo. It was one of the few I hadn't thrown away, a snapshot from years ago, back when the smiles still looked real. Mom, Melissa, and me, sitting on the porch steps, summer light spilling across our faces. I held it for a long time, tracing the worn edges with my thumb, feeling the ghost of that day flicker somewhere deep inside my chest. For a moment, the temptation rose sharp and hot, to tear it in half, to toss it into the trash and let it disappear along with everything else I had walked away from. But I didn't. Instead, I crossed the room and opened the drawer of an old cedar side table I had rescued from a thrift store. Inside, among a few stray pens and forgotten receipts, I placed the photo gently, closing the drawer with a quiet click. The past would always be there, folded neatly into the corners of my story. But it no longer defined me. It no longer dictated the shape of my days or the weight in my chest. I stood up, stretching toward the ceiling, feeling the lightness settle deeper into my bones. There were still walls to paint, bookshelves to build, gardens to plant. There was a life waiting for me, quiet, stubborn, beautiful, and for the first time, I wasn't carrying anyone else's burden with me, just my own, and that was enough. Outside, the breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging by the porch, their music bright and low and sure. I smiled and picked up another box, ready to start again. Free, at last.